I'm here with Luke Burgis, who's the author of this wonderful book. It's called Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life. And what this book is an application, I'd say, to everyday life of the theorizing of René Girard. And René Girard is someone who's influenced my thinking a lot. He's not a household name the way, let's say, Heidegger or Sartre or Camus would be, but I think he ranks with those figures as a seminal thinker of the 20th century. I wonder maybe we'd start with just a little bit about him. So who was René Girard?
René Girard was a Frenchman who came to the U.S. shortly after World War II, landed at Indiana University, bounced around to different universities, and spent the last roughly 15 years of his life at Stanford University. And he's famous for really articulating an insight into the very fundamental nature of human desire. And he did it across studying literature, anthropology, theology, sociology, just a very sort of broad understanding of human reason. And his insight was that the nature of human desire is mediated. It's fundamentally mediated. And this was an insight that nobody had quite put their finger on before.
Let me get to that just in a second, because that's, I think, at the heart of the theory. Let me just tell you, I had a chance to meet him, maybe 25 years ago. He was giving the Meyer Lecture, which is a lecture series at Mundelein Seminary, where I was teaching. And Girard would have been, I guess, in his high 70s, maybe early 80s at that point. And to me, the most remarkable thing about him was his head. He had this enormously big, impressive head. And when I met him, he's an old man, he had a shock of gray hair, but still black eyebrows and this big, impressive head. And so he was a remarkable figure, physically remarkable. And then his theory got the attention of a lot of people. I first heard about it from a colleague of mine, and once he explained the basics of it, it's one of those theories where you start seeing it everywhere. Like you can't unsee it. And at the heart of it, as you were suggesting, is this idea, I think, of mimesis, or an imitative quality to our desire. Tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah. So mimetic is a word that comes from the Greek word that simply means to imitate. So Girard's insight was that desire is not, as we normally think of it, generated ex nihilo. We don't generate our own desires. We imitate the desires of other people. We're social creatures. So we have models or mediators of desire from the time that we're babies. Our first model of desire or mediator is probably our mother.
Yeah.
And as we go through life, we adopt different models of desire that help to show us what to want. And most people don't realize that this is happening, right? We like to think of our desire as autonomous, as something that's completely our own. But Girard said from the beginning, that's not the nature of desire. Even look in the very first chapters of Genesis in the Bible. Where did Eve get the idea to eat the fruit? Well, this desire was suggested to her. She had a mediator of desire. And Girard continues to go through the entire scriptures, the entire Bible. He looks at literature and he sees this pattern of mediated desire absolutely everywhere. And he draws very fascinating cultural connections because he says that this mimetic desire naturally leads people into rivalry and to conflict.
Let me stop you there, because that's what I find so intriguing, because it's a sort of triangular theory. So I'm not just wanting something out there, that's a good thing, I want that, but it's by way of another desirer, right? So I want that because you want it. So it's a triangular quality. I always think of if you're watching little kids, like little toddlers, and there's a whole pile of toys, and toddler A is completely indifferent, right, to any of the toys until toddler B wants that ball. Then suddenly that ball is all toddler A wants, right? It's not some intrinsic value to the ball. It's that toddler B suddenly wants it. And if toddler B suddenly said, I have zero interest in it, the first one would lose interest, right? So the triangular. So here's the question. When I'm talking about Girard with people, I say, well, okay, so what? What's the matter with that? Why is that a problem?
It's a problem because it leads us, my introduction to Girard, quite frankly, was coming to grips with my own entanglement of desires, right?
Yeah.
My own highly mimetic desires that were leading me into rivalry, misery, disordered desire is, I think, at the heart of Girard's theory. And there's a whole theological perspective to that. Our desires are disordered. Because rather than look to, from a Christian perspective, the source and summit of all desires, where all desire returns to, we begin looking to our right and to our left at what other people want and what other people want for us. From a vocational perspective, that makes discernment very, very confusing and difficult. But I think that this idea of mimetic desire is at the heart of what it means to be human and kind of the conundrum that we face as human beings. And Girard looked at the 10 Commandments and actually said, pay attention to the 10th commandment. It's very interesting because it's different than all of the rest. You have commandments sort of 5 through 9 that are articulating prohibitions against specific objects, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery, against, you should not desire another's spouse. And you get to the 10th commandment, and it seems to prohibit a certain kind of desire entirely. Girard, in one of his books, he says it's almost like the 10 commandments were trying to show us something behind the desire of the objects, something that goes even deeper. And in the 10th commandment, he says, don't desire, your neighbor's spouse, your neighbor's ox, or any of these things, or anything that your neighbor desires, because what your neighbor desires, you will end up desiring. And that's the key turning point. The objects are not the critical part. It's the fact that the neighbor is fundamentally mediating the desire for whatever the neighbor wants, which leads us into conflict with our neighbor. And Girard said, what is it about the neighbor that's so important in the 10 Commandments? And he said that most human conflict is internal conflict, internal to families, internal to the church, because it's our neighbor that we're constantly looking at, who we end up viewing as a rival to us because they want what we now want, because we're looking to them to mediate our desires.
Right, instead of being lost in the beauty of an object or in the beauty of some goal, I'm always looking sideways to you, well, he wants it, and is he getting more of it than I'm getting, and is he ahead of me in this? And so that's the dysfunctionality of it, huh? And hence the importance of that word coveting, right? That Girard thought, let's just translate that into plain old desire, right? Because covet sounds a little bit maybe recherché, but don't desire, what your neighbor's desiring because your neighbor desires it. So he sees that this dynamic is uncovered in the Bible, huh?
Yeah, and Girard really came to understand this through a very powerful personal conversion experience.
Tell me about that.
So when Girard was 35 years old, he sort of likens his experience to Dante. He was in a dark wood of his life with in his own entangled desires. And he was living in Baltimore, teaching at Johns Hopkins, but he taught a class at Bryn Mawr University in Pennsylvania. And he was taking a train back and forth every single week. And he describes almost a mystical-like experience on the course of that train ride, where he began to come to grips with his own sort of vanity and pride as an academic. The vanity of his own desires, right? Like why he wanted certain kinds of prestige. And he was writing a book at that time, his very first book, called Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. He was almost done with that book. And the book was about kind of the structure of some of the great novels in history.
Dostoevsky, he's very interested in.
Flaubert, Proust.
Right, Proust.
And he was analyzing the nature of desire in these novels. And he got to the very end of it. He was almost done. And he noticed something, first in the authors and then in himself. And he noticed what he called a literary conversion. I find this really fascinating because there's some parallel to a spiritual conversion. And he said these authors, all these great authors, underwent a kind of literary conversion experience. When they started, Dostoevsky, for instance, at the beginning of his literary career, his enemies were his own scapegoats, right? A very sort of stock, black and white, Manichaean, good versus evil. And he was very removed. He was narrating the stories almost from the outside of this experience. And he said, these writers, Dostoevsky in particular, had to undergo a kind of conversion experience in which they saw their own vanity and pride. And they looked at the first draft of their novels, and it looked like trash. These characters looked stock. And they realized that they were bound up in the very toxic desires of all of the evil characters in their book, for instance. And they went back and they rewrote the works. from the inside of desire. Yeah. So their own experience of their mimetic desires were manifested in the works, and that's partly what makes the work so powerful. So Girard basically went back and rewrote the last chapter of that first book, and he explains the experience of these novelists as a kind of conversion experience, which he himself was undergoing at the same time. And at the time, he was, French academic, very skeptical, agnostic at best. And that conversion experience on that train led him to become to become a Catholic. He baptized his children within the next 6 months, and was in full communion with the church. And it was a beautiful sort of way that he described the experience. He said it was almost like everything came to me at once on that train. And I spent the rest of my life trying to penetrate this dense mass of insight that I received. And he said nothing was not already in the scriptures.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I saw some perspective, some, I guess, anthropological perspective about the nature of human desire that I spent the rest of my life trying to unpack and explain.
There's so much there. And you're mentioning Dante intrigues me because envy, Dante's very aware of it. Dante himself wasn't unlike Girard at that point in his life. I mean, a guy very motivated by success as an author, success in the political arena, loses all of that and comes to some very powerful insight. But in the Divine Comedy, in the Purgatorio, the envious are punished by having their eyelids sewn shut so they can't see what's around them. It strikes me as very interesting. Let's say the academic arena. I was in that for years teaching. What would your life be like if you really didn't even see what other people were accomplishing, what other titles they got? What if they didn't see you? So I mean, I got tenure. Well, why does that matter? Well, because so people can see I got tenure. I got something that you don't have. Or that guy got tenure and I didn't. But what if I didn't even see it? And there's something that's salutary about that, of getting your eyelids sewn shut, because it means I'm not doing all this furtive glancing around to my rivals, right? And I can actually, at the end of the day, lose myself in things that are really objectively good. And I'm not caught in this terrible dynamic of the mimetic rivalry.
Girard actually has a very interesting interpretation of the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8.
Tell me about that.
And he talks about the eyes. His focus is on the eyes of Christ and the eyes of the scribes and the Pharisees. So desire is mimetic, okay? That can be positive.
Yeah.
We have the example of the saints, for instance, right? Positive examples of desire. They desire the kingdom of God, right? But desire we can also imitate very negative desires, including aggression, accusations, the accuser, right? Satan, the accuser. So Girard was fascinated by the story of the woman caught in adultery. This woman is dragged before Jesus. The scribes and the Pharisees say that she was caught in the very act of adultery. What do you say that we should do? Jesus very famously, bends down and begins to write something in the sand, in the dirt. Scripture doesn't say what it is. Catholic tradition has often said perhaps it was the sins of the scribes and Pharisees. Girard says maybe Jesus was averting his gaze from the eyes of the scribes and the Pharisees, averting his gaze, because mimesis, especially when it turns accusatory and violent, almost acts as an energy. You look into the eyes of somebody else and you almost catch, by contagion, some of their anger, some of their rage. And he said, Jesus averted his gaze, and it really struck me. And he diffused what would have certainly ended up in the stoning of this woman. He subverted the scapegoat mechanism, which is a mimetic process. Forget for a moment why somebody is being accused of something, whatever they did. They could be guilty. The mimetic process that takes place, in some sense, is detached from whatever the crime was, real or perceived. And I think that's very interesting. So how does this mimetic process get subverted? It takes somebody to step outside of it and not follow the logic of the mimesis.
There's so much that's going through my mind. One is social media. Girard dies what year? 2005, something like that?
2015.
Oh, was that late, 2015? So he
2015.
did experience, he did know some of the social, because I think the social media world is a massively Girardian space. That the dynamics, you want to see them, just go on social media. Talk about like the mimetic crisis, the mimetic frenzy that can take place on social media. How keenly aware we are of what other people are seeing of us, how we see them. Look at the satanic, the blaming, the accusing. Look at the cancel culture. I mean, all of that is Girardianism in spades, isn't it? But what's occurring to me is something that Arthur Brooks said, Arthur, the great cultural commentator, that you think about social media, he said, just turn it off. And it'll be amazing how quickly you're liberated from that world. In other words, you take the simple step of saying, I'm not part of it anymore. I'm not going to pay attention to it. I'm not going to listen to what people say. I'm not going to watch what they're seeing of me. I'm just out. There's something of that, isn't there, that is the key to liberation. I got to step out. I got to sew the eyelid shut. I got to step out of it.
There's something to be said about extracting ourselves from the mimetic process.
Yeah.
So for me, it happened in the context of a silent retreat, a 5-day silent retreat, where, thanks be to God, the retreat director gave me that 8th chapter from John to read every single day until I finally got the point.
Yeah.
And I wonder, if I hadn't been extracted, if I had been on social media every day, I would have went to it with different eyes.
Yeah.
Right? So there's something to be said about creating this space. One of the reasons that I think social media is so incredibly powerful and hard to resist, such an incredible temptation, is because it creates it's made everybody our neighbor in the sense that the 10th commandment is describing.
Yeah.
Everybody is now our neighbor.
Right.
So one of the most important distinctions that Girard makes is between two different kinds of models. There's an external mediator of desire. This is somebody who's outside of our world. St. Francis of Assisi, external mediator of desire for me, positive model of desire for me to follow. And there are internal mediators of desire. These are people that are in my world, not necessarily geographically speaking, but existentially speaking, socially speaking. So I can come into conflict with them. I can become their rival. And on social media, everybody is essentially an internal mediator of desire. It's as if they were sitting right next to me.
Yeah.
It creates the illusion that we're closer, in a sense. Than we really are.
Your distinction between Celebristan and Freshmanistan, am I saying those right?
Yep.
As I understand it, so there's a mimetic thing that goes on with celebrities. I can say, hey, look at that, that rock star or that basketball star, and I want what he wants and so on. But there's something that's not as harmful about that because the person is so distant, they're not part of your world. But then I think we all understand Freshmanistan. When you were a freshman in high school, you were a freshman in college, all these people thrown together in one social space from different backgrounds and all that, we're all painfully aware of what the other is achieving or not achieving. We all see each other all the time, which is why these mimetic frenzies can break out, right? And that social media has produced Freshmanistan for everybody all the time. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, the whole world is sort of like being in a freshman class again.
God help us. The worst time in your life when you were a freshman.
Yeah, and social media has brought us all back into freshman year. I think that's right. So Girard would say that mimetic rivalry, that the destructive negative form of mimesis, is strongest and spreads the fastest the more that people are similar.
Yeah.
More that people are similar. And if you think carefully about social media, everybody has the same kind of a profile. So people play funny games to differentiate themselves. And it sort of creates a situation where the uniqueness, individuality, unrepeatability of the human person cannot be fully appreciated. And I think that's one of the reasons why it exacerbates the mimetic desire, because we feel the need to have our own voice, but we're taking our cues from all of the wrong places, which are just to have a sharper take than the next tweet or whatever it is, and we can tend to lose ourselves that way. Yeah.
Hey, in terms of getting out of the mimetic thing, so I talked about the Arthur Brooks, like just get off of social media. I love the story you told there about the Ferrari-Lamborghini rivalry, and how one of those figures found a way to get out of the really destructive quality of that mimesis. Maybe help our listeners with that story a little bit.
So most listeners will know the manufacturers of the supercars, right? Ferrari and Lamborghini.
Yeah.
Some people don't know that Lamborghini was founded by an Italian man named Ferruccio Lamborghini, who started out making tractors. He made some of the best tractors in Italy, and he was a successful businessman. So he himself owned a few Ferraris, as one does as a successful Italian businessman in the late 50s.
Yeah.
And he was driving his Ferraris all over the place, and he kept having a problem with the clutch in his Ferraris. Kept breaking the clutch, and he would take it to the Ferrari shop, they would fix the clutch, he'd have a problem 6 months later. He finally got so fed up that he decided, and his story might be apocryphal, but it's true even if it didn't happen in this sense. Something happened. He confronted Enzo Ferrari, this great titan of automobile manufacturing and racing, personally. And he said, I've been spending a fortune on your clutches, and they keep breaking. And he goes, in fact, I had my mechanics look at your clutch, and you're using the same one that I use in my tractors. And I just, fixed my car, and I did something that you couldn't even do. And Enzo Ferrari kind of brushed him off. Some people say, he said, why don't you just stick to making tractors? So Ferruccio Lamborghini says, I think I can make a better car. And he goes back to his factory, and he transforms part of his business into a car manufacturing business. Partly born of this rivalry with Ferrari. The idea had never crossed his mind to make a car until this happened. So in some sense, mimetic desire was involved in his very decision to enter that process. I think the important part of this story, though, and he went on to make a very successful car in 1966, and then for many years after that became a real rival to Enzo Ferrari. And to this day, the companies are still rival companies. But at a certain point, he realized that if he took the rivalry to the end, it would end up destroying him on a personal, maybe even spiritual level, and that he needed some way to not just respond and react to whatever Ferrari was doing. That's the problem with a mimetic relationship, right? Tit for tat. Somebody sends me a passive-aggressive email, my mimetic instinct is to send one right back. And in rivalries, this happens all the time. It's like the other person is essentially making you a puppet of whatever they do or whatever they desire. So Enzo Ferrari wants to win an automobile race. Well, if Lamborghini is just behaving with mimetic logic, well then he has to win an automobile race. And he realized he had to remove himself from the logic of unhealthy mimetic desire. He took stock of what was really important to him in his life, his family, his son, and he made the decision to extract himself from the rivalry and not enter the racing business was one decision he made. He actually wrote it into the bylaws of his company and retired to a farm and ended up making wine and lived happily to the end of his days.
We can get out of these things, that's the point. I mean, we're, by a kind of awful instinct, and I would say now as a Catholic, a theologian, that's one of the marks of original sin. I mean, that we're drawn by a sort of wicked instinct into these things. But it's possible to get out of them. It's possible to find a path forward. I think that's a hopeful sign. I also love the story you tell about the French chef and the Michelin guide, so the famous Michelin guide that what every French chef wants is to get the approval of the Michelin guide, and you get stars and so on. And it's, I think you tell the story that there's a chef will commit suicide if he gets a reduction in the Michelin guide. But there was the chef whose story you tell, who at one point just said to Michelin, I don't care. I don't want you to list me in the book. Tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think mimetic desire is particularly important when it comes to one's vocation. There's so many different mimetic voices out there, right? Showing us the way, showing us cultural totems of status and prestige that we can often really forget to listen to the most important ones, right? For a Christian, what does God want for my life, right? That's the most important desire to imitate. Sebastian Bras grew up his dad was a chef in France. And from a very young age, a French chef learns that the most important totem of success is to get a Michelin star, and then to get 2 Michelin stars, and then to get 3 Michelin stars, and then what? Well, to keep your Michelin stars.
But how awful, just as you lay that out, you think how awful to live in that space.
Right.
Because you're never at ease. You're never at rest. You reach the pinnacle of success, and now I've got to stay there. So my entire life, I'm in the prison of anxiety.
Right. So that goal was essentially, he adopted that goal without ever questioning that goal.
Yeah.
And we do that. I've done that in my life, right? Like, why do I desire this thing in the first place? And he began to question the logic of the Michelin star system. Now, I think we all have a Michelin star system. We all have a Michelin
some version
guide.
of it, yeah.
Mine just might look different than the Michelin guide. But he was miserable. It was affecting his family life. And he decided to tell Michelin just not to come back to his restaurant. And this was not viewed kindly by the Michelin
anybody.
guide.
And the other chefs too, I imagine, right?
By the other chefs. And Michelin, I suspect, was, even if they wouldn't have articulated it this way, they were worried about the mimetic consequences of his decision. Well, if he doesn't care about us, then maybe other chefs will start not caring about us.
So it makes everybody nervous because he's breaking out of a system that's self-perpetuating.
He's breaking out of a system. And they didn't come back until the next year, when they said, we don't care about your request. We're going to come back and rate your restaurant anyway. And by the way, now you have 2 stars. But I traveled there and I talked to Sebastian Bra.
Yeah.
And I said, well, how did that make you feel now that you had 2 Michelin stars? And he just laughed. He laughed. And he said, I laughed when I got the phone call because I stopped. I just didn't care anymore. I'd broken out of that in sort of some kind of a permanent way. And there was no going back once I saw the vanity and the sort of illusory status of it. And I realized that ultimately it was going to make me empty.
Yeah, no, I mean, the spirituality there is very profound, and all the spiritual masters will tell some version of that. In a way, René Girard is like Marx, and he's like Freud, and he's like Nietzsche as a master of suspicion. What I mean is, he looks behind what appears to be something rather ordinary and acceptable, but actually what's really going on here is something a little more nefarious, So I like, he's an unmasker, isn't he? He reveals dynamics that we're not always aware of. I think there's a line in your book about the people around whom we orbit without knowing it. So I just think I'm living my life and I'm seeking goods. Oh yeah, that's good. But actually, I'm like a little moon around somebody else, right? And I'm just concerned about that person's approval, how that person's doing. Are they ahead of me? Are they behind me? And I'm just orbiting around. And I think I'm living my life happily. But in fact, I'm caught in one of these awful rhythms. And so Girard there is like a voice of liberation, isn't he? Like, come on, it's time to break free of this stuff.
He really is, and being intentional about the kinds of models of desire that we have in our lives. So it's one thing for me to say that I desire some virtue, that I desire holiness or something like that. But if I don't have a single person in my life who also desires that thing, it'd be very hard for me to pursue that with any kind of constancy, with any kind of permanence. So we often think about role models. These are people that model a role or some kind of a behavior. But what Girard is saying is what's far more important is paying attention to what the people in our lives desire. He even speaks about Christ in this way. He says, when Christ says, follow me, imitate me, he's not talking about his clothes, the way he dresses, necessarily the way that he speaks. Fundamentally, he's saying, imitate my desire what I desire, which is to do the will of the Father.
Right.
So at a profound level, we're affected by the desires of other people. And those desires can lead to rivalry and conflict, or if there's some transcendent dimension to those desires, then they can lead us out of whatever that box is that we're calling.
Yeah, and I want to make sure, by the end, we get back to some of those really religious dimensions. But I want to take one step, though. So we talked a lot about mimetic desire, which I think is the key to getting the Girardian program kind of off the ground. And for a lot of people, it's a liberation just to unmask that. But the second move in Girard's theory is the scapegoating mechanism, which we've talked about a little bit. But this is when I learned this for the first time, I thought, yep, it's pretty much universal. In fact, the man who first introduced me to Girard put it this way: wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, look for victims. Now, the dynamic is when these mimetic crises emerge, so they could be like just you and I might be in a mimetic rivalry, but now we're in fresh Manistan. Now with the social media, we're in fresh Manistan all the time with everybody. what happens is not just two people in a mimetic rivalry, but now everybody in a mimetic rivalry with everybody else, which produces an enormous crisis of anxiety and violence at the limit, right? So that breaks out. Well, what happens, Girard speculates, is by a kind of mechanism, largely unconscious, we choose victims. We choose a scapegoat upon whom we can cast a lot of this negative energy. We blame that person or that group. What came to my mind, and you bring this up, and Girard, of course, was a literary man, but think of that marvelous story we all read in high school called The Lottery, right, by Shirley Jackson, that weird story. And probably a lot of our listeners remember from high school that this little kind of village out in the farm country, and people are gathering for what looks like a festive celebration, and everyone's having a good time and talking. But then it becomes clear, well, there's going to be a lottery. They're going to choose somebody. You think, oh, someone's going to be honored, someone's going to get a prize. But then the story gets darker and darker and darker, and then you discover by the end, the one being chosen is the victim, who has to be stoned to death so that the crops might grow. It harkens back to an ancient, sensibility. But it's got Girard all over it, doesn't it? Then think of Lord of the Flies, another book we all read as kids. Same dynamics. Think of The Hunger Games. When I saw The Hunger Games, I never read the books, but I saw a couple of the movies. It's René Girard. I mean, this is René Girard all over the place. Think of Carrie. Think of the Stephen King story. Think of Billy Budd. Herman Melville, I think the greatest American writer of fiction. Avant la lettre, understood Girard perfectly, it seems to me. Or think of, I'm a Chicagoan. I don't know if you mentioned it, but the Steve Bartman phenomenon.
Steve Bartman.
Maybe our viewers don't remember, but what was it, 2004 or something, when the Cubs were about to enter the World Series, and the fly ball comes to left field, and the left field is about to catch it, and then this poor kid, Steve Bartman, who was the biggest Cub fan in the world, reaches out and blocks the ball, and the guy drops it, and then the Cubs lose. And I remember it watching on TV vividly. This poor kid, young guy, little glasses and the hat, and he had the little headphones on, and there he sat in all of Wrigley Field, and all of the TV audience blaming him. That's the guy. And he had to flee for his life. I'm not joking. He had to be at police protection for the foreseeable future. They ended up ritually destroying the ball that he had blocked, My point here is yes, René Girard saw something that was very real, that we do all the time. We choose victims. Very often someone who looks funny, who sounds funny, who is a little different from another group or whatever it is, and we say, nope. And as you said, one of the two names of the devil in the Bible. The first one, diabolos, the scatterer, but the second one, Satanas, the accuser, right? Anyway, I've been carrying on too much there, but talk about that a little bit. So following mimetic desire, which leads to mimetic crisis, we have the scapegoating mechanism.
The scapegoating mechanism is really fueled by this idea that we can solve our problems by eliminating someone or something from our midst.
Yeah.
Our problems are never our problems. I think this goes back to original sin. Our problems are never our problems. And humans tend to think that violence can drive out violence.
Yeah.
This is what Girard calls the satanic principle. That if we just do a little bit of targeted violence, it will save us from ourselves, right? That's the problem. And this works through a mimetic process. I think the connection between mimesis and the scapegoating mechanism is not well understood. It works through a mimetic process. So going back to, let's use a baseball analogy.
Yeah.
You ever seen a guy rush the mound in baseball, right? That's an extremely mimetic act, because once the second guy runs out of the dugout to get involved with the fight, and the third guy, and the fourth, and the fifth, it gets easier and easier.
Right.
And if you're the last guy on the bench, and you don't run out there, then you might have problems.
You'll be the scapegoat.
You'll be the scapegoat. So it's why, you're right, so the choice of the victim, of the scapegoat, is often somebody that is an outlier for whatever reason. But it's also chosen randomly. Shirley Jackson, The Lottery, right?
Yeah.
Because once the mimetic process starts, it perpetuates itself. It's why in the ancient stoning rituals, why is the first stone so important? This saying has come down to us, he who is without sin cast the first stone. What is it about the first stone that's unique? Well, it's the only stone that doesn't have a model. The second stone has one model, the third stone has two models, and it gets easier until it's infinitely easy to cast the hundredth stone or something like that. So what I didn't realize when I was poring over this text of the woman caught in adultery, day after day, wondering why the retreat director wouldn't give me a different text to read, and becoming frustrated. The Girardian way to view that text is that the woman caught in adultery was a scapegoat, and the scribes and the Pharisees probably had all kinds of internal problems, right, of their own.
There was a meta crisis going on.
There was a meta
undoubtedly.
crisis within their community, and they had found an outlet for that crisis. Now, we know it in that story that the woman was caught in the very act of adultery. So she was guilty according to the Mosaic law. The point is that it doesn't matter in terms of the scapegoating process whether the scapegoat is guilty or innocent. In fact, a guilty scapegoat, I think of Muammar Gaddafi, the former leader of Libya, actually makes it easier for the people to have him stand in for the guilt of everybody else. Right? They serve as an effective mechanism through which people can transfer their own guilt, and it actually warps our. There's an epistemological sort of angle to this too. It convinces us of the guilt of the scapegoat and of our own innocence. That if we just get rid of that person, which causes us to not deal with any kind of sinfulness, systemic problems, we're under the illusion that we've banished our problems. And this goes right back to an ancient ritual in Leviticus, right? Literally, it's where the word comes from. The sins of the people are symbolically transferred onto a goat who's driven into the desert.
Yeah, and again, once you see this, it's hard to unsee it. People are on a table talking, and for a time we might talk about the weather or we talk about the Cubs or something. But before you know it, we're scapegoating somebody. I mean, it just watch it. So our viewers, just watch it. Next time you're sitting down with friends, I'd say within a couple of minutes, you'll be blaming somebody. Did you hear what she did? Yeah, I heard that too. And I hear she also did. And what's happening there, I think what Girard saw was, we get a thrill from that. There's an ersatz sense of communio that comes from that. Like, oh yeah, oh you saw that? Yeah, oh yeah, I did too. And now we've all come together. We've sort of cast our tensions and anxieties onto this person. Now, the trouble is, the minute you get up from that table and walk away, chances are it'll form anew around you as a scapegoat. We talked about academe, and that's the world again I knew pretty well. There's this famous saying, what's the one thing two academics can agree on? How poor the work of a third academic is, right? I mean, academics never agree about anything, except, did you read his paper? Oh my gosh, awful. I read it too. What a pathetic, thing. So it happens there. Then it happens culturally, it happens geopolitically. Famously Hitler exploits the Girardian dynamic. Why were all these awful tensions in German society in the 1920s and 30s? Well, because of the Jews who stabbed us in the back in the war, the Jews who undermine us economically, it's the Jews. So this dynamic, it's just almost inevitable, isn't it? It just is part of our makeup. And again, I would say, given original sin, this thing is just exacerbated.
Yeah, there's a catharsis that comes from binding together to expel or eliminate a scapegoat. Yeah. So there's a unifying effect and a bonding together that creates a false community and a temporary peace. And that's very important. It's just a temporary peace. Yeah. So Girard would say that community, worldly community at least, and culture is founded on the back of a victim, of a concealed victim. At the bottom of many human communities, maybe all human communities, is some concealed victim. He uses the example of the Egyptian pyramids, literally, right, of a victim on the bottom. Yeah. And he says that you could think of them as the cultural successor to a pile of stones from an ancient stoning rite. I think that's a fascinating way to look at it. So the scapegoating mechanism actually forms community. And Imagine, though, if there were a kind of community that were formed not based on collective violence, but on something else.
Interesting, of course, that the biblical thing, which Girard helped me to see so clearly. Who's the founder of cities in the Bible? But Cain, who slew his brother Abel. So it's the murderer, indeed from the beginning, is the one who found cities. St. Augustine noticed that. He said, look, Rome says the same thing, that Romulus kills Remus and founds the city of Rome, but Rome kind of celebrates that. But the Bible, much more perceptively, says, oh no, the murderer from the beginning is the one that found cities. Well, then go forward in the New Testament and the account of the temptation of Jesus, when Satan says, I will give you all these kingdoms if you bow down and worship me. Well, how come he can give them? Because he has them all. They're all his. What's his name? The accuser. That the accuser is the one who gave rise to all the kingdoms of the world. And he's trying to get Jesus to do what people have done from time immemorial. Worship me. Play my game, right? Play my game of satanic blaming. And you can have all the kingdoms of the world if you want. Jesus blocking that, refusing that, not just at that moment, but in his entire life, and then we'll get there at the culminating moment of his life. Isn't that what Girard saw as so basic to biblical revelation? That it unmasked something. Because, help me now with this a little bit. Because the scapegoating mechanism does give us an ersatz peace, or at least a temporary sense of community, we sacralize it. Hey, this is good. This worked. The gods must approve of this. And even go further, the victim himself becomes kind of a sacred figure, right? Because, hey, that's how we brought peace to the community. How many myths and religions, Girard says, are predicated upon this weird move? That scapegoating violence is sacred, right?
Right.
And something gets unmasked, doesn't it, in the Bible? But anyway, talk about that a little bit.
In the scapegoating rituals and mythologies, violence is sanctioned by the gods.
Yeah.
Right? Because the only people that are left to tell the stories are the victimizers, are the people that they themselves were involved in the scapegoating mechanism. So these mythologies develop where the gods sanctioned violence, and the person who was scapegoated was always truly guilty of some crime, and they deserved it, and the actions of the community brought some kind of peace. The Bible is very different, because throughout Scripture, going back to the Old Testament, the story of Joseph, for instance, God takes the side of the victim. And the true process that's happening is unmasked. And we see, in the case of Joseph, for instance, it's almost like we're allowed to go behind the curtain of the scapegoating mythology and to see what's really happening. And we see that Joseph is, of course, innocent. And this happens time and time. Job, right? Job, who's being accused by his very friends, right? So we see this, and this culminates in Christ and the crucifixion, where it's very different. It's than any other kind of story that's like this that's ever been told. We have the early community of the apostles who are going out into the world and saying and promulgating a very different story about what happened. And we see the scapegoating mechanism completely unveiled. And we see how, in a sense, Girard would say that the crucifixion of Christ demythologizes all mythology. It's the end of mythology, right? It's the anti-myth.
See, something in Girard that I always found fascinating, because I came of age at a time when theological liberalism was all in vogue. And one of the marks of theological liberalism is to show the points of contact between the great religions and mythology, right? Think of someone like Joseph Campbell and recovering the ancient myths. Think of liberal theology from Schleiermacher on, that all the great religions are basically saying the same thing. We're all climbing the holy mountain by different paths, but we're going to the same goal. And René Girard was like a wrench in the works of that kind of liberalism, because he didn't think Christianity was saying the same thing all the religions were saying. In fact, au contraire, he thought it was unmasking what the other religions and mythologies tend to mask, right? It was a revelatio, it was a pulling back of the veil on this sacralized violence. And the crucified Jesus, as you say, God not on the side of the victimizers, but God identified with the victim of Caiaphas, perfect Girardian, right? Who says, well, wouldn't it be better for one person to die than for the whole nation to be destroyed? I mean, look, wouldn't our mimetic crisis be resolved beautifully by just killing this guy, this weirdo, this outsider? Or think of the scene of Peter in the courtyard of the high priest's house. Well, he was with him. His Galilean accent gives him away. And Peter knew he was in serious danger at that point because there's the scapegoating mob forming. But God, on this Christian telling, is not identifying with the scapegoaters, but rather with the one who himself is the victim. Yeah, so it's something fresh, it's something new, isn't it?
Girard changed my understanding of a revelation.
Right.
Of revelation by, sort of showing that, Christianity revealed something that had previously been, the world had been completely blind to, that humanity had been blind to. And it took, the God-man to reveal this. Somebody who himself was not inside of this mechanism, right? Who was not subjected to the mimetic mechanism, right? To the disorders that have happened. And this kind of goes back to original sin. So in other words, it took God to reveal this to us. Girard referred to Caiaphas and sort of cynically said he's the greatest politician who ever lived because he knew that the scapegoat mechanism was affected. Caiaphas wouldn't have called it that, but he somehow knew that this is a way to create some temporary peace by finding somebody to put all of the blame on. And what's interesting about the crucifixion and the resurrection is that a new kind of community was founded. This was a community that was not founded on scapegoating violence, but was founded on forgiveness and love, right? Radically different. What's the first thing Christ says? Peace be with you. And it's the only community, right? A Christian would argue that's been founded on something that didn't rely on this sacrificial, some form of violence, some form of concealed victim.
Yeah, it's new, it's fresh, it's a revelation. And we shouldn't water it down and say, oh, it's just one more iteration of human religiosity. It's a breakthrough. It's a revolution. Here's something I find really intriguing, and you talk about this in the book. Has Girard, in a significant way, won the day? Because today, what are we obsessed with but victims? And siding with the victim. I mean, that's everybody's instinct today. In fact, if you're siding with victimizers, you're an ultimate bad guy. So, I mean, has Girard carried the day? Has he convinced people that, we should be massively on the side of the victim? Or is something else going on with that today? Talk about that.
I don't think he's won the day, and here's why. Girard would say that the crucifixion and Christianity has permeated our culture, whether people know it or not, actually, to such an extent that we're hypersensitive to victimization, to innocent victims. And in a sense, the victim is the one universal principle that is spread throughout the world, right? Our sense of the victim. However, so in a sense, the scapegoat mechanism doesn't work the way that it used to, because we don't really believe in it the same way anymore. The problem is, from my perspective, this is my take on it, the world seems to be trying to sort of to sort of protect the victim and to make continual reparations for the violence in the world, while at the same time rejecting the only sort of sacrifice that claimed to have done that permanently, once and for all times. So it's hard to recognize at an intellectual level what we're doing without sort of accepting what needs to happen spiritually in order to be able to not continue to engage in that process and to create new victims, just different victims.
Because it's happened, hasn't it? I mean, the cancel culture, which has arisen from a preoccupation with victims, has produced a whole different set of victims. So that we're just drawn right back into the old mimetic problem, the old mimetic crisis. So it looks like a way out, but it really isn't.
Well, with cancel culture, sometimes I wonder, where's the forgiveness, right?
It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. So forgiveness was crucial for René Girard. The time has come. He was very apocalyptic at the end of his life. And he said, the time has come to forgive one another. because the time is running out. And when I look at some of cancel culture, I don't see that aspect of it, the forgiveness, the love. Right? What is love? It's willing the good of another. And it's so easy on social media. It makes it so easy to get involved in conversations where, are we really willing the good of another? It doesn't seem like it. It certainly doesn't seem like it.
It's a built-in problem. I've been on social media now for a while, and those com boxes and all that, and social media. They're some of the vilest places on planet Earth right now, it seems to me. I don't go on Twitter anymore because I think that's the nec plus ultra of this vile quality. It's like it's introduced all the Girardian dynamics at a deeper, more intense level. And breaking free of that and using Christian revelation itself as a way to do that. Watching for victims, watching the scapegoating dynamic, watching mimetic rivalry. It's just massively on display in social media. Which I think is the reason why the Christian church, above all, needs to be a voice, but not just sucked into the maelstrom of this weird world, but coming from a different place. And maybe the voice is, get off of it. Get off of social media. Just close it down. Maybe that's the Christian voice at the moment.
Which brings to mind a word for me that is not very popular. You almost never hear this word today. Is renunciation.
Yeah.
Renunciation, right? So it could be renouncing the temptation to be on social media and to be involved in some of these toxic discourses, but also renunciation of the mimetic impulse, right?
Yeah.
To sort of rise above that. And I often ask myself, to what extent does that require, something supernatural grace? But it does. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do to renounce the mimetic impulse, and that is fundamental, right? To escape the logic of the zero-sum game, because we can engage in the scapegoat mechanism from what we believe are the noblest of motives, right? To do justice, right? To fix a problem in the world. And Girard says, well, that's fun. That's exactly the problem, right? Is that we don't realize that we're doing this. In fact, if we realized that we were creating a scapegoat, that we were involved in the scapegoating mechanism, well, then it wouldn't work. It requires a kind of unknowing, right? Which the revelation unmasks. So I think it's very difficult to address because it involves a level of self-awareness and renunciation, even of things that we might consider our noble kind of intent.
I think it requires grace. I think that's absolutely right, because you've got to break out of something. You can't stay within the confines of that old system and try to fix it. You don't fix it from within. As Aquinas said, if the will is broken, you can't will your way to a better will. The will needs to be invaded by something outside of itself. And I think that really applies here, that if we're caught in these Girardian dynamics, we're not going to will our way out of them. We have to, something's got to break through. And I would say it's the grace of the cross and resurrection of Jesus. And I think it's a way for Christians to reclaim the centrality of the revelation contained in Christianity. It's not just one among many, but it's the decisive way out of this. Let me ask you this about, you talk about thin desire, thick desire, which I like, that distinction. And it's related, I think, to negative mimesis. We've talked a lot about that, but then positive mimesis. We've gestured toward that. When I say, for example, hey, there's Mother Teresa, who's serving the poor of Calcutta. And I want that. I want what she wants, right? At the limit, there's Jesus, the good shepherd who says, come follow me. And yeah, I want what he wants. Name what's decisively different about that kind of desiring what the other desires and the negative type.
Yeah. One fundamental difference is Girard talks a lot about metaphysical desire. He says, desire, tends to be desire for something metaphysical, meaning beyond the physical, right? Something completely outside of the physical realm. We could call it spiritual. And healthy mimetic desire doesn't devolve into rivalry. So it's not, I want to, Mother Teresa has inspired me to serve the poor. But even that good desire can lead into all kinds of weird things if now I want to be seen as the person who's
Eat my dust, Mother
heroically.
Teresa. I'm going to be better than you
Sure,
are.
sure. I mean, there can be mimetic rivalry in the pursuit of holiness.
Yeah, right. Oh, there is.
There is.
I've seen it for sure.
So it's the kind of mimetic desire that I think has a transcendent goal.
Yeah.
Right? Has a transcendent goal, so that, and this is why I keep coming back to the idea of vocation, right? Personal vocation. That's unique. So I can live out my vocation completely, and there's room for my vocation. There's room for yours. There's room for my friend's vocation. And if I do this thing, or if he does this thing, it's not less for me. Doesn't mean, so that it's the kind of mimetic desire that, because it's rooted in something that transcends the sort of worldly logic of this sort of zero-sum game, we can avoid the trap.
Yeah.
So I think that idea of having a personal vocation is absolutely fundamental. And then being vigilant. So being constantly vigilant, that Girard would say that even what starts out as positive mimesis can devolve into negative things. So you have a community founded on forgiveness and love, which we would call the church, right? Even within the church, right?
Not the church. None of this in the church.
That doesn't mean that there's not scapegoating that happens within the church, because
all the time.
There's a process of continual conversion. Conversion is not a one-time thing.
I want to be the boss of the community that's predicated upon forgiveness and love. And who are you to tell me,
And let's drive out the people that are causing all of the problems in the church. So
no, absolutely. And our best people, spiritual people, have always seen that. They've always seen, corruptio optimi pessima. I mean, that these dynamics take over within the life of the church for sure. I go back here to Aristotle, whom I quote a lot in this context, where he says, two people will fall more deeply into real friendship the more they together fall in love with a transcendent third. So it's not just we like each other even, it's together we love philosophy, together we love our country, together we love whatever the transcendent ideal is. And there's something inexhaustible about that. And that's why it's a mutually enhancing relationship, not a rivalrous one.
Right.
So two friends that they love philosophy together, and they because philosophy it's endless. You don't run out of it. We're seeking wisdom, or we're seeking God, we're seeking justice, we're seeking something which is in itself inexhaustible. That gets us out of the rivalry game, doesn't it? Because now it can be mutually enhancing. Together we love this transcendent value.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis has this beautiful imagery. I think it's C.S. Lewis, who describes standing shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face, gazing upon some transcendent good.
Yeah.
And that has always been an image that I have in mind with friendship, right? Gazing together at some transcendent good. If I remember correctly, Francis of Assisi had this beautiful holy relationship with his sister foundress. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. St. Clair. Yeah. They wrote these letters together in the pursuit of, but very different vocations. But in a sense, they spurred one another on in love, right? And that's a beautiful thing, right? It's something that my wife and I would say, try to engage in some form of positive mimesis with each other. And when a positive sort of cycle starts, I would say there's even probably a Trinitarian aspect here. The gift of self, right? Giving totally to another, and the gift of self back. There's positive mimesis involved even in that.
And that's the way out, isn't it? That's the model that's proposed to us as a way forward for all this. Let me ask you a last thing. We both obviously love René Girard, and we think he's full of insight, which indeed he is. I mean, whenever I talk about him, I just find new depth, in his vision of things. Is there a danger in Girard? And I remember when I met him at Mundelein and we had a chance for Q&A, I asked him this question. Is there a danger of what they call the theory of everything quality? That it is extraordinarily insightful, but is it trying to explain too much? Is it naming something obviously real, but is it too englobing an explanation of things? How would you respond to that?
Well, Girard himself said that he didn't actually discover anything new. He said it was already contained within the Gospels, right?
Yeah.
And I think he left a theory that we have a lot of work to do, right, to sort of unpack it and to understand it at a deeper level. one doesn't have to accept the whole thing to draw tremendous fruit from certain parts of it. So to give you an example, my initial attraction to it was not the scapegoat mechanism. It took me a little bit longer to understand. It was the way that unhealthy mimetic desire had really got me off track in understanding my purpose in life. So in my own vocational discernment. So I think everybody has a different doorway into mimetic theory. And Girard said, it sort of will take sort of an interdisciplinary group of people to probe this. And he encouraged that we probe it. I'm inherently skeptical of theories of everything too. Right. But Girard said, there was this single dense insight about the nature of human desire. That and desire is this, it's this metaphysical sort of principle that does affect everything. I mean, what does desire not touch? Right? It's part of who we are as humans. The real temptation with Girard's work, in my opinion, is the naturalistic kind of approach to it. And what do I mean by that? It's to view this, to over-intellectualize what he's saying, and to try to strip the spiritual out of it, to almost use it as a technology. Well, now I understand mimetic desire, I can become a better investor. Now I understand mimetic desire, I can organize my company in this way. Maybe. But the naturalistic doesn't go far enough, right? Because he's speaking about something at the very heart of the human person, right? And one of the striking questions that was posed to me, this really sums up the approach. It was, in the 8th chapter of John, the woman caught in adultery, was that a miracle that Christ worked? Was that because we normally don't think of that as a miracle, but that really got me thinking. Well, does it take something that's not natural, that's supernatural, what we would call grace, in order to bust out of these negative behaviors? And I would say absolutely yes. So that to me is the greater temptation, is the application of mimetic theory. Oh, great, so I understand mimetic theory, so what? What does this mean? Well, it means nothing if I don't go out and love my neighbor, if I don't forgive. Yeah.
Let me ask you, how about a last thing? I speak now as a churchman, as a bishop in the church. What's the best thing the church can do in terms of making these Girardian insights applicable to people's lives? What's the best thing we can do to overcome mimetic rivalry, to overcome the scapegoating mechanism, to show a way forward? What can the church do?
I firmly believe the most important thing the church can do is to help every Christian, every person, understand that they have a unique personal calling from God. Because I do feel like that is the way out of the negative mimetic behaviors, right? The clustering, the different groups that are pitted against one another. When people understand that they have a transcendent purpose that's only been given to them, that they have a mission, a vocation in the world, and if they don't carry it out, it's lost to the world forever. There's nobody else that can carry it out. That's a transcendent dimension. And the church, it would seem, it's part of the church's mission to help the individual Christians to understand and to live out their individual vocations.
It's super helpful, and it's language that I try to use a lot, but you're helping me see it in a Girardian framework really well. That Newman has that wonderful reflection on the mission that has been tailored for you. It's your mission. Because then who cares how other people are doing? Who cares what they think? Who cares what they're desiring? They got their mission. You got your mission. So do it. And look at that. Look outward at the mission God's given you, and don't worry about the way other people's desires are affecting you, who's rising, who's falling, who's higher, who's lower. So that's very useful. That's helpful, I think.
Yeah, I teach a class of freshmen at Catholic University, and the class is called the Vocation of Business, and it's really about vocation. And we start out by saying, what can you do better than anybody else in the world, right? You, Kate, specifically, what can you do? And of course, it's to be the fullest version of Kate, right? Going back to St. Irenaeus, right? The glory of God is man fully alive. So it's Kate fully alive. And that's going to look differently than anybody else.
So that's helpful to me too, because it's not Kate finding herself, and that's the rhetoric of today, because that's going to draw you right back into mimesis, it seems to me. But it's Kate discovering what God wants Kate to be. That's the game. And that will get you out of these mimetic frenzies, right? But you play the game the way people play it today, which is, I find my voice. I think that's going to suck you right back into the satanic cycle.
Because there's no transcendent dimension to
Right.
that, right? I mean,
Right.
what is your voice? Well, often the voice is just, how are you differentiated from everybody else on social media?
It's the voice.
What's your brand?
Right.
Or something.
Yeah. Or all the people I'm playing with on social media and bouncing off of, and forget all that.
You
Get off of
can't find your voice in Fresh Manistan. That's
Right.
a very hard thing to do.
That's good. So it's the recovery of vocation and the looking outward to what God wants me to be. Well, good note to end there, Luke. Loved the book. Thought it was wonderful. And
Thanks, Bishop.
I think this Girardian stuff is of enormous moment for our society and for the church today. So delightful talking to you today.
Thanks for having me on.